Hello everyone, and welcome to part 2 of this special edition of Dominaria's Judgment. And if you're thinking to yourself, that does sound like a weekly modern podcast brought to you by StarCityGames.com, but I don't know why it's special or why it has 2 parts, then go and check out part 1, go check out the article that goes with this piece over on the website, and if you're all caught up, then welcome back. For this part, we are talking to the designers of Modern, the people without whom Modern as we know it would not exist today. We have Gavin Verhey, who is a leading figure still in Magic design. Back in 2011, he was unknowingly working in parallel to our other guest here, creating a prototype of Modern that helped to get his foot in the door and get him where he is today. And those other guests are Tom LaPille, who had to make the hard decisions here if he wants someone to blame for Blood Moon or Ensnaring Bridge sneaking into Modern, as well as Zac Hill, who is a senior designer at Wizards, intimately involved in all of this. We get the inside scoop on how Modern came to be, their views on where Modern has gone since then, and even a few game design and product design takes on Modern Horizons sprinkled in there too. Thanks for listening to part 1. Hope you enjoy part 2. We're joined now by Gavin Verhey, who I would say has one of the more unique roles and more unique perspectives on the creation of Modern as both an outsider and an insider here. So very intrigued to get your perspective on both sides of that process, Gavin. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's so great to be on the show and to finally meet you over the internet, Dom, but also to hang out with Ari. And Ari and I have known each other since we were like 13-year-old kids. So it's a true pleasure to be on the show today.
Yeah. I think that most of the cards we played against each other in our first match are not even Modern legal.
Oh, yeah, absolutely not. Like we were playing Wild Mongrels and Equilibriums and stuff like that. And those are a little before our Modern's time, although they were legal in Overextended, which I'm sure we'll get into here in a second.
Absolutely. And you are the one authority, I would guess, on that format that we could dial out to speak to here. But I guess starting a little bit before that, I guess when most people are writing the history of Modern, they would make this rough leap from Extended to Modern with that one often missing step in between. As someone who was in the trenches, playing PCQs and writing for Star City Games about Extended and other competitive Magic during that time, what was your take on the role of Extended within that competitive ecosystem?
So I always really enjoyed Extended as a format. It was actually one of my favorite formats to play. And to this day, mini extended formats are still some of my favorite formats in Magic history. Like I think back through, I think it was like Extended circa like Shards of Alara era. Just awesome, right? So many decks you could play. A lot of really, really great memories from that format. And even with the, Pro Tour Berlin and all the elves, I thought it was still really fun to play. Lots of cool decks. But the problem with Extended was that people only played it during the time you were being told to play Extended, right? People would pick it up for PTQ season. Then they would not play it afterwards. Then they'd pick it up next year for PTQ season and then not play it afterwards. And of course the time was different back then too. To set the stage, we're talking mid-2000s with Extended. And there weren't as many Grand Prix, and they would tend to stick to similar formats next to each other, right? So you would kind of have that extended season once again, and then you'd move it to a different format later on. So, you would kind of pick it up for one era, and then you have your PTQ seasons, which were one format extended in this case, and you'd play it for that era, and then you just kind of, put down your cards and move on. And the problem was it's very hard to attract long-term players that way because if people aren't playing it all the time, then no one's ever going to get into it just to play it for fun. And to a less enfranchised player, it didn't really seem like the format to get into. You couple that with the rotation, and the way that Extended worked, for those who don't know, is Extended rotated every 3 years. So every 3 years, a rotation would happen, and 3 years worth of sets would rotate out. So it was like one big rotation, basically. And that would really change up the format and how it all looked. But it would definitely disincentivize you to get into the format as much. And that was something I started to notice, and I'd heard Wizards talk about, and that's where I started to get some ideas from.
It's interesting because almost everyone that we've spoken to for this has said the same thing regarding Extended, is that they personally loved it. And so if you just use that as a representative sample, you would think, well, why bother creating a new format in the first place? It sounds like Extended was a roaring success. But beneath that core of heavily enfranchised players, it seems like the format, because of some of those structural issues and so on, just wasn't really gaining any long-term traction.
with Extended in particular, the other problem is it was a little opaque. We'll talk about this in a little bit, I'm sure, but one of the strengths of Modern is it's very clear what you can play. Well, ish. And with Extended, it was like, what's legal? And I have to go look at a long list of sets, and when do these things leave, and when does rotation happen? It's every 3 years, and a lot of things that made it a little more opaque, I think, to a less enfranchised player. And it's the kind of thing you forget when you're in the trenches and you know what all the cards do by heart,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they even had like some weird cutouts, like they didn't want the dual lands to rotate, so they hung around for an extra who knows how long. Just weird stuff happened with that.
Yeah, totally. In the early 2000s, right, you had the dual lands sticking around for a prolonged period of time, which is wild, right? It was Extended plus dual lands. And the first Grand Prix I ever played, actually, was Extended. It was Grand Prix Seattle in 2003 or 2004, I think. I played Blue-Green Madness, because Blue-Green Madness for life. And I did not do very well. But I remember even at the time, like, I was playing Blue-Green Madness because it was the deck that I was at a PTQ. I was at a PTQ, and there was a side event, a GPT being run for Extended. And at the time in my head, I'm like, I could never play Extended. I don't know what's illegal in it, and it's too complicated to figure out. And I saw my friend playing a Blue-Green Madness deck, and I was like, well, I know Blue-Green Madness. I played that in Standard last year. I can go play that in Extended. And that's actually how I got into playing Extended. But I think for a lot of people, it was, you hear that it's got so many sets legal and you don't know what they are, and there are all these cards, and it's extremely daunting to hop into. The other thing about Extended, and once again, we'll talk about this in a moment with Modern, because I think it's quite interesting. But the other thing with Extended is originally it was partially envisioned as a place you could take your standard decks when they rotated out to go play with, because when your standard deck rotates out of the format, it's nice to have a place that those decks can go live and go, and that you feel like, taking the time to get the cards for Blue-Green Madness or something else has actual longevity to it. So it literally worked exactly as intended. But the challenge was, in my case, worked as intended. But the challenge was that wasn't really what was happening for a lot of people. And, the decks were very different than what you were used to from Standard in most cases.
I think that brings us to a good kind of transition to talk about, I guess we'll start with what was overextended and what was legal in it that wasn't legal in Modern, and kind of how that format came to exist the way it did. Like, what inspired you to make Overextended?
Right. So the deal with Overextended, so to understand Overextended, you have to understand a little bit about my background. So if you don't know me, I'm Gavin Verhey. I'm a senior game designer on Magic the Gathering. So I design what cards do. And I've been at Wizards for about 10 years now. I love my job. It's amazing. And I've always wanted to work at Wizards of the Coast. When I was 11 years old, I wanted to have the job that I have right now. It was literally my dream job to do it. And I set up my life so that I would be in the best position to get this job from a very young age, and just pursued it all the way through. And basically what I was told was, I needed to graduate college. I needed to be a Magic player that people knew. Like that was a recommendation I got from Randy Buehler, actually, when I was 11. He told me this, and I really stuck with it. And so the year 2009, 2010, and at that point, like, I was known in the Magic community a decent amount. I was writing for Star City Games. I was playing in tournaments. People recognized me. I was also about to graduate college, and I was like, okay, well, I got to figure out how I'm going to get a job at Wizards, because I haven't really heard anything from them yet. And at the same time, like, totally on a different axis, I was talking with Brian Kowal of some kind. We were just talking about how there were all these sweet cards that you couldn't play anywhere, because they had rotated out of Extended, they were not good in Legacy or Vintage, and how there just was a huge gap of cards that you couldn't use anywhere. And at the same time, it was pretty public knowledge that from Wizards of the Coast and what they had written, and just what we had observed, the Extended was not super hot. People did not really enjoy it. And so when me and Brian talking, we had just the initial seeds for this idea, which was a non-rotating format that shows a specific point in time, and from there on, everything was legal. And it was just a conversation over dinner, basically, that started this. Then we started building decks in our head and talking about all the cool things we would do and the cards we would play that were no longer legal and Extended. Then I just started thinking about it more and thinking about it more and thinking about it more. And a trait that I have that, for better or worse, I have is if I get an idea in my head, no matter how wild it is, and it sticks for a little bit, I will eventually do it. It's just like a Gavinism. It doesn't matter like how wild it is, how silly the idea is. And with this format idea, like a lot of design ideas had entered my head and left. But I was like, I just kept thinking about it and building decks in my head and getting excited about it. So I was thinking, and I was like, well, at the same time, I'm trying to get this job at Wizards of the Coast. I wonder if I could use launching a format as something that could parlay my way into a job that would get their attention, that would be really big. Now, here's the thing. A lot of people call me the grandfather of Modern. They say, Gavin designed Modern. And it's the way of shortcutting it, but it's not really the whole story here, because while I was thinking all of these thoughts, what I didn't know, and I had no way of knowing, is that Wizards of the Coast at the very same time was working on a parallel track to also create a format that would be non-rotating. They've been talking about it too. So we're working on things in unison. And of course, Wizards of the Coast is a whole team. I think it's Tom LaPille who's heading up that project. And I'm just one guy, and I'm still at the end of college. And so what I start doing is I start building decks and playtesting against myself to try and figure out what the right cutoff for the format is and where exactly it should be. And I identify a few really good early ones. Some good options that I considered were Ravnica, because I felt like the Shocklands were a really great foundation for like what modern Magic is. I considered Mercadian Masks, because it's after the Urza Saga, but you still get cards like Brainstorm and Dark Ritual, which are quite strong. I considered Mirrodin because of the new card frame, but I was like, well, the new card frame is basically a lie anyway. Like, there's all kinds of cards that are going to be in the new card frame that aren't legal, right? So that's not really true about Modern. And where I settled on that I liked the most was back where my original idea was, which was Invasion, right? Invasion is a very nostalgic set. A lot of people came in with Invasion, Odyssey, and Onslaught, which at the time to me were like in the right band of nostalgia, right? They'd rotated out of Extended, and you'd start with Invasion and go forward. And so I started working on it and started playtesting decks against each other and identifying a ban list, which I created. And then I have the site all ready to go. I built up my own website. I'm all ready to launch it. I'm a writer at Star City Games at the time. And I have my website ready to launch on Monday. And I have this huge article called, it's like Show Up or Shut Up, Overextended or Bust. And I'm like, I'm going to call the format Overextended. The idea of like this like extra format. I've been put so much work into this, and I'm about to announce it on Monday. And on Friday, it's either Thursday or Friday, I think it's Friday, Wizards of the Coast posts an article about how they're going to be running Modern in the Community Cup, this brand new format no one had ever heard of called Modern. And it's kind of, some people like, I think someone could see that as like getting scooped, like, oh my gosh, Wizards scooped me. But I knew what was going to happen, which was there's going to be so much chat around all this stuff in the same 48-hour period. And nobody in the world had done as much work at that time on working on a non-rotating format as I had with Overextended. So on Monday, I launched my article, and immediately it took off. And people wanted to talk about it, and I started running events on Magic Online, like casual events where basically I would hand pair all the matches in a separate, in like DCI Reporter basically, and then I would share the matches with everybody, and they would play each other. And we were getting, we started off small with like 20, 30 people, and then we're getting 40, 50, 60, 70 plus. I think we even broke 100 people a week. I had a day called National Overextended Day, where I got game stores all around the world to run Overextended events at their store. And there were tons of stores around the country and world that ran Overextended events. And it picked up a ton of traction. And people were really excited about it. And, there were some decks that were available there which are not legal in Modern, right? People were playing Psychotog and Blue-Green Madness and archetypes that just have cards that were not Modern legal. And eventually, this went on for maybe 3-ish months or so, and the Community Cup came and went, Modern was played at the Community Cup, and my format kept going and growing, and eventually there's an article by Tom LaPille where they talk about how they're going to introduce Modern as a real format. It's going to take over Pro Tour Philadelphia. It's going to replace Extended, which at the time, Wizards had done a lot of things to try and fix quote-unquote Extended, and at the time they had made this kind of like last-minute call for that season to change Extended to be 8 sets big, which was not a popular decision. And so it was kind of a rough format anyway. And so I think with 4 or 5 weeks notice, basically, I don't remember the exact number, but I think maybe 5 weeks, they changed the format of the Pro Tour to be Modern. And in the article where they announce it, and this what meant so much to me, they call me out and they're like, hey, Gavin's overextended was huge and influential in what happened here. We didn't end up going with this cutoff. We thought that, we preferred modern for these reasons, but, thanks to Gavin for accelerating the process and making sure it could happen sooner. So that's kind of the full arc of overextended. And, ultimately, having been at Wizards, having seen how the format has unfurled, after seeing what has happened, I think that it was probably correct to choose the Mirrodin starting point. I don't know how much of a difference it would have ultimately made because there's not like that many cards you can pick up from Invasion, Odyssey, and Onslaught blocks, save for the fetch lands, which are there now. But it was a huge moment for me and my career and my ability to design something because, not long afterwards I was hit up by Wizards to take the test to come work for them. And that's the origin of overextended and kind of, in a sense, the origin of modern too, and how we get to the incredible Pro Tour Philadelphia, which I think is one of my favorite Pro Tours of all time. And who knows if we'll ever see anything like that quite again.
Did it warm your heart to some extent to see some of those cards from that Invasion through Onslaught era that fell through the cracks a little, so to speak, which to see some of those come back in the Modern Horizon sets where, we get Fractal Fiction in Modern, for the first time. But was that, did that feel like things had come full circle there?
Yes, absolutely. It was so cool to see these cards because, part of the reason why I chose Invasion was Invasion Forward is there are honestly just a handful of cards for Invasion, Odyssey, and Onslaught that I really wanted in the format because at the time players were like in your head, right? These were just cards that were iconic, like Thatcher Fiction. And that's why I wanted to include them. So if you look at how Modern has turned out over time, now a lot of those cards are just legal, right? You can play Factor Fiction in Modern. A lot of the Onslaught Goblins, if you want to play Goblin Pile Driver, it was reprinted in Magic Origins. Like that's an option you can do now. And, it's hard to remember this or hard to know this if you have only been playing the past few years. But pre-Modern Masters 1, we did not reprint very many Magic cards, right? We were mostly just printing Magic sets with new cards, and occasionally you would have a Plane Chase or, you'd have your Commander deck or something that would reprint cards. And especially there's nothing like Horizons, where the idea of getting a bunch of cards into a format was generated.
Did that overextended experience and then seeing how Modern has grown and been cultivated over the past decade, did that give you any takeaways in terms of what can be done to encourage interest in the format? So, the story of Commander might be illustrative here as well, right? Where it goes from mostly a diversion being played by judges at events, after events, and then somehow it grows and blossoms into being, by many metrics now, the most popular and most successful form of Magic.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest takeaways I've learned with Modern that I never expected is when you talk to a lot of players, totally kitchen table Magic players, and you ask what format they play, if it's not Commander, which is, a common answer, but if it's not Commander, a lot of the time they will tell you Modern. Modern has become a frame of reference for people, right? People who don't have a lot of the older cards, for people who don't want to play with, what they perceive as the broken cards, or they've only been playing, for the past 10 years or something like that, which is a wild thing to put only in front of. But anyway, they just play Modern with their friends, and they're not playing Amulet Titan, they're not playing, whatever, they're not playing Scape Shift deck, they're not playing anything like that. They're literally just playing things that are probably weaker than standard decks, but they just call it Modern because it's cards they own constructed, and oh look, the cards they own happen to be Modern legal. It got those grassroots formats, and I think the key things were the non-rotating. I said that the biggest key was the non-rotating format, right? It's easy to learn. Just this year or earlier, this set or earlier or later, is fair game, and you can play anything from there on. And there's no weird rotation. There's no your cards don't become legal at some point, which is really huge. And if you look at Commander, one of the biggest factors of Commander for people is that your decks don't rotate. Aside from a ban that might happen in Modern, if you build a Modern deck, it's just good forever. And that's so powerful in Commander as well, because if you haven't played for a while or you just have a deck you love, you can always play it no matter how bad it is. And if you look at a Modern tournament, if you look at, Magic Online Modern events or your local stores Modern events, you will see people playing decks that are that deck's straight out of 4 years ago, But man, they just love it, right? And they have a good time with it, and they go 2-2 at FNM, and they're happy because they got to play a deck that they loved. And that wasn't happening with Extended. It just wasn't happening. And to me, those are two pretty big takeaways of where Modern succeeded.
Did it seem like this initial Modern experiment had been a success? And where did you think the format was going to go from there?
If you were not there or not watching the coverage at the time, the thing you have to understand about Pro Tour Philadelphia is there's never been any Pro Tour like it that I can think of, and I don't know if there will ever be one again given the technology that we have now. Because you're introducing a brand new format to Magic. There are not quick testing resources for it. No one has really played it before. There just haven't been events for it. And it's using a bunch of cards that have never been mashed together before. And now, even if we introduce something like Pioneer, for example, you're going to have seen a lot of these synergies. You're going to know what decks have existed from seeing them being played in a larger card pool like Modern. Like a bad Modern deck might be a good Pioneer deck in some cases. But in Modern, like no one had ever tried some of this stuff together before. And it was wild. Like seeing the decks that showed up, like the Poison deck with Blazing Shoal was wild. The Cloud Post deck that showed up was wild. It felt like everyone was doing a broken thing, but because everyone was doing a broken thing, somehow it was all okay, right? And then somehow in the middle of this event with turn 2 Blazing Shoal kills and Cloud Post casting Emrakul quickly, there are people who are doing well, just like casting Tarmogoyf and Fiery Justicing their opponent's creatures, right? Literally nobody knew what was going to be good going into this event. And that was amazing. And I truly don't know if we will ever see anything like it again. It was just a magical feeling. You could tell there was a magic to the format that hadn't been seen in a long time. I have a personal line, okay? I want to be very clear before I say this. This is not play design stance. This is no one's stance except for my own, okay? So this is not like a Wizards of the Coast stance. But I have a personal belief that formats that are broken at the Pro Tour, not broken going into the Pro Tour, but formats that are broken at the Pro Tour generally make for good coverage and good watching, and then they make for bad formats afterwards, right? Because when you go into a Pro Tour where things seem broken and everyone's playing ridiculous banana stuff, everyone wants to watch it. Like, you're like, what wild deck am I going to see next round, right? And literally at Pro Tour Philadelphia, you had no clue what was going to happen next round. People would sit down with decks and you're like, this guy's got Tallow-Wisp and this person's playing Blazing Shoal, like just like totally different ends of the spectrum. The problem, of course, then comes in the PTQ format where then it quickly gets ground out which is the best broken thing to do. And so I think coming out of Modern, out of the Pro Tour, like I did think it has legs, and I was really excited about it. As I said, there was some magic in the room, pun intended, I guess, for sure. But I also knew there were going to have to be some bannings, and it's that reason exactly, basically, why with Pioneer, instead of kicking things off with a Pro Tour like what we did with Modern, there were events run on Magic Online first to kind of test the format and figure out the ban list, because there's clearly going to be stuff that we missed. Brokenness does not equal an untenable format. It just means you got to go ban some cards.
As Modern Horizons, was on the horizon, I guess, as a concept, did it feel like that was really heading into new territory, or given the work that you had already done on these other products or other formats, did that not feel like it was crossing a line in the same way?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked for a very long time about putting new cards into Modern via a Modern-only booster set. I remember when we were talking about the first Modern Masters all the way back in 2014, 2013, the idea was pitched, and we were designing it, of course, even before it came out, a year before it came out to the public. We talked even then if we should put new cards that were Modern legal in that format. Now, it was didn't get a lot of traction, and at the time the sentiment was definitely, no, we should make sure that cards only go into the format through the crucible of Standard and Limited and everything else. I think, like all things in Magic, over time, the formats change and things about the game change and they evolve. And that's kind of what's happened with Modern Horizons. I think it would have been wrong. I think it would have absolutely been wrong early in Modern's life cycle to have introduced a Modern-only format, because you want to give people the time to play with all their old favorites and do understand the format and know what's there. And by the same token, I think that later on in the life cycle of Modern, like where we are now, and when I say later on, just to clarify, I'm not saying that like we're toward the end of its life cycle. I'm just saying that we're further along, just so no one out there gets too worried. Later on in Modern's life cycle is the right time to introduce something that has a bunch of new cards enter the format, because what has existed has been mapped out pretty well and has been played for 8-9 years. It's a fine time to try doing something pretty big. And to get back to something I was saying earlier, so when Extended was first conceived, part of the idea was that you could go play your old standard decks there. With Modern, that was a huge part of its conception of there was not a place inside of Wizards. What I learned is there was not a place for people to go play their old standard decks, and that's what Modern should be. And at the beginning, it was certainly not that with all the combo decks running around. But then, after all the bannings happened and things settled down a little bit, I don't know about porting your standard deck directly into Modern, but there were a lot of standard cards that certainly saw play in Modern and really made their way all the way into the Modern format. And it stayed that way for a little while, but the problem with a non-rotating format, and this is the inherent issue with it, and the reason why Extended had rotation, is the larger a format gets, the more powerful it gets, and the harder it becomes for any new card to make an impact in the format, because every new card has to fight through that many more sets of cards every time a new set comes out. So, when we made Pioneer, which unfortunately did not get the launch that I'm sure we were all hoping it was going to given COVID, but I do hope we get to go back there afterwards. When we made Pioneer, that it was, okay, Pioneer is now going to be the place where your decks have rotated out of Standard are eligible, right? If the deck rotates out of Standard, you could consider playing it in this format, and maybe the deck won't be as super strong, but some of the cards will at least make it there, and so on. And at the point you do that, then it's, okay, well, what is the target for Modern now if it's not accomplishing this previous goal? And making a set that's for it, changing up what the format looks like, injecting some archetypes in that people might have been asking for a long time. That's something that we wanted to give a roll to. And that's why we finally pulled the trigger on doing this Modern only booster set. Now, I think after doing 2 of them, we have, especially after doing 1 of them, but after doing 2 of them, we've learned a lot of lessons. And I think we're going to take all those all to heart if and when there is a Modern Horizons 3. For example, there's a lot of feedback in the community right now about the format's actually pretty good, but it feels weird that it's like Modern Horizons constructed, right? And there are so many Modern Horizons cards getting played in decks. In the first Modern Horizons, I think we learned about the dangers of some of the things that we pushed there. I think with Modern Horizons 2, there were a lot of successes as well. A lot of things we tapped into that people really did like, and we, amped up a few archetypes that players, even at the social casual level, got excited about. So we'll see what happens if and when there's a Modern Horizons 3. But I will say this, we are 10 years into Modern. Modern is not going anywhere. We have no plans to discontinue the format. And I think at this point, it's just going to continue to be a permanent fixture of Magic.
Yeah, it can't be seen as anything other than a smashing success, I think. I've got one more question lined up, but I guess the first question I should ask before that, is there anything else that, springs to your mind from the PT Philly days or the overextended days or anything in the middle that you kind of want to really highlight as like this important thing that didn't really fit anywhere else?
For me, a huge part of Magic is always the community. I mean, Ari, you know this better than anybody. We were talking on the internet when we were 13 years old, building decks together from across the country when no one else was doing that, right? I know that sounds wild to say now, but, there didn't used to be all these ways to contact people online. You had to make forums or whatever. And community's always been so huge for me with Magic. And really when I think back about Overextended and Modern and the early days, and when I think about Commander and how it got to where it is today, having that natural community-rooted format has really done so much for the growth of Modern. And the fact that people were behind Overextended on Magic Online playing events, that players were excited about it, everyone from pros to just random people on Twitter were excited about talking about the format. In Commander, it was the same deal, right? You just had that homegrown in Alaska by Sheldon Menery and his friends, this format that grew and grew and grew through articles. And when I look at the history of Magic formats and what has been the most successful in most cases, a lot of it is that community-grown stuff. And I think we've learned a lot from that. Looking at some of our less successes, I would say. If you look at Brawl, we really tried to engineer that format, and we didn't take a lot of the learnings that we should have taken into account, right? It didn't feel community grown. There was not a community support for Brawl before we launched it. It had a rotation on it, which we knew that people who play socially don't like very much, and it chases them out a little bit. No, it ended up turning out great in the end because it turns out that Brawl is exactly what Arena called for. So even though we didn't make Brawl for Arena, it ended up being the perfect fit for Arena, which is great. But, when you look at less successful formats, like how Brawl turned out in paper, I think, you see that. Similarly, like looking at Pioneer, I feel, out of all the things that have hurt us with COVID, I mean, we've had a great year. Magic's been doing awesome. Make no mistake about it. But I definitely feel for Pioneer because we had really, really primed Pioneer to do so much cool stuff in 2020 with the format and really give it the launch that it deserved. And then to have all the events pulled out from under it, well, without events at both the large and in-store level, it's so hard to get traction on the format from that grassroots level. And Pioneer never got that grassroots support. And I'm certainly, a little afraid that maybe when we come back, people will have forgotten about trying out Pioneer. And I hope that people do give it a shot and that maybe we do eventually get that excited in-store grassroots level of support for what's happening with the format. So we'll see on that end. But this all comes back to just when you think of Modern, you imagine the Pro Tour. You imagine these broken things happening. But really what Modern is it is a unified way for people to play Magic that is not unlike Commander. It is a word that you can use it because you have a Modern deck in your knapsack. And whether you're killing people on turn 4 or attacking with a 6/6 for 6 on turn 6, that can be Modern. So it's meant a lot to a lot of players, and that grassroots support has been crucial for it. And I think we should all do well to remember that as we work and talk about the format.
Yeah, absolutely. And with that in mind about Modern Horizons 1 and 2, the question I wanted to ask you was, going back to this initial question, what is your favorite old card that has been snuck into the format this way? And what's your favorite new card that's kind of found its way in through Modern Horizons?
Oh, that's a fantastic question, Ari. I mean, I think for me, to a point that was brought up earlier, it really is those cards that I envisioned as cornerstones of the original overextended format that made it in. And Factor of Fiction is a pretty big one for me, as well as Counterspell. I think everyone wanted Counterspell from the beginning. But Factor of Fiction has always been one of my favorite cards. And in my head, when I was making Overextended, that was going to be like a poster card. I was going to talk about it all the time. I thought it was going to be a huge player in the format. And it was, by the way. People played a lot of Factor Fiction and the overextended events. And so to me, that is like a huge one that made it back in. And, it's funny. When we were working on Dominaria, I was on the design team for Dominaria. When we were working on the set, we wanted to try and get Factor Fiction into Standard. And I was so excited about this because if it got into Standard, that would mean, of course, it would go into Modern. And ultimately, as you can imagine, it was a little too strong for Standard. Maybe a lot too strong for Standard. But we had to sideline it, but then it came back in Modern Horizons and it got printed into Modern that way, which made me very happy. And even though, like I said, it's not the strongest thing you can do in the format, it's a card that I've always loved and is very skill intensive, and I'm really happy that it's there. In terms of cards that are, I'll say that one thing that made me really happy in the first Modern Horizons set, I'm going to call something out here that I think is a little emblematic of what I've been saying, even though it's not particularly good in the Modern format, which is we introduced a lot of cards for a slide style deck, like Astral Slide. We introduced Astral Drift, I think is the card, a bunch of other cycling cards. We put the cycling lands back in. And to me, like, that allowed a lot of people at a lot of game stores to build up cycling decks in Modern, which is maybe something that they remember from years ago or they had never experienced before, where they got to build it up and play it. And even though it wasn't good in competitive Modern or, top level competitive Modern, it was still really fun to build, and people had a lot of fun building it. And to me, that goes to show how it's not always about the top cards in the format for Modern.
I should have figured that, given some 1 a.m. Astral Slide mirrors played on the floors of hotel rooms.
Yeah, I do.
You may or may not have been involved in.
I remember a great time where Ari and I and some others were staying together for a Grand Prix, and it was like midnight or whatever. And I think it's Ari and Max McCall, Max is my coworker now, get into an argument about who would win the Astral Slide mirror and what the best sideboard tech was. And they agree to build up right there and then Astral Slide deck lists and play them against each other. And it was a truly glorious. To me, that was like 2000s Grand Prix at their finest. You're crammed into a hotel room, everyone wants to sleep, and there's two guys who are like, no, we're going to settle this right now. Astral Slide, the Astral Slide, and we're going to see whose sideboard is the best. I think the deal was you had to play the identical main decks, but you got to play whatever sideboards you wanted, and you wanted to see which sideboard tech was stronger.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
I've not thought about that Ari in a very long time. That wasn't even connected to my story at all. But yeah, that is a good memory.
Yeah. And related to the other card, Fact or Fiction did in fact, as we're recording this, so it'll go up a little later, but it won a Modern Super qualifier this last weekend in the hands of Guillaume Wavotapa. So I don't think there's like any more fitting state for Fact or Fiction in Modern. Yeah,
that's cool. I guess one other thing I'll say is the thing I love about Modern Horizons, I'm a student of the game, as are you, Ari. I love trivia. I love references to things. Time Spiral is my favorite block of all time. So, of course, I'm a huge sucker for all the other things we've done that are not just the, not just the top level cards in terms of, nostalgia and hitting on old cycles and stuff. So, Crashing Footfalls is super cool. I know that's actually a good deck you can play too, but I just love that this is a reference to the cycle in Modern Horizons in Time Spiral of all the free spells you had to suspend. And of course there's a green one because Hypergenesis is banned in Modern, right? So fills this hole that existed. And to me it's this meta game commentary level that's both commenting on the set Time Spiral and commentating on the banned list of the Modern format. And then we made the card and now you can actually play it, right? You Shardless Agent into it or whatever, and it's a good time. And I think that's pretty cool.
Well, I think that's all I've got. Anything else you want to close out with, Tom?
No, other than to thank you once again for just the overextended experience. I had a lot of fun as one of those random Twitter people taking part in those. But hard to complain as well with the trajectory that Modern has taken over the past 10 years. That's been so much fun to spectate and to take part in myself. And I was glad to have this chance to reminisce, and it sounds like both of you guys were as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, a lot of memories. It feels like both yesterday and a lifetime ago, and a lot of memories have been generated over the past 10 years. And here's to 10 more great years of Modern.
So that was Gavin. I think after that interview, you can clearly tell why he got where he is and why he's such a good ambassador for the game. And now turning to someone who is not inside WotC headquarters anymore, but was for a good while here in the period we're talking about, and that is Tom LaPille. We'll talk to Tom after these messages.
It's preview season once again, and you know what that means. StarCityGames.com/previews is where you can find all the Innistrad Midnight Hunt sealed product and signals for pre-order. Innistrad Midnight Hunt is shaping up to be a worthy successor to all the prior Innistrad sets, and no matter what format you play, there's sure to be a banger in there for you. Put in your order for collector boosters, draft boxes, commander decks, alternate art werewolves, or just good old slow lands, and it will ship out right when the set releases on September 24th. As the rest of the set gets revealed, those new cards will be added to the site, so if something catches your eye, you know right where to find it at StarCityGames.com/previews.
And we're joined now by Tom LaPille, who may be more responsible than any other person for Modern's creation and early development. Is that fair to say, Tom?
I think it's a little aggressive. I don't know. I may be one of the two people. Aaron Forsyth was the one who gave me my marching orders when I started running around the building and making it happen. But I should probably introduce myself a little bit because I've been hiding under rocks for a while, I think. So my name's Tom LaPille. I'm a game designer. I was at Wizards from 2008 to 2014. I touched every standard set from Conflicts to Magic Origins. I was the lead final designer on M12, Dark Ascension, Born of the Gods, and Dragons of Tarkir. And as you mentioned, I was one of the major players in the beginning of the creation of Modern. And so that's why I am told that I am on this podcast.
Something like that, at least. Just an excuse to talk to you. But
sure.
Let's, I guess, go back before those game design days to the playing days, because there were several precursors to Modern, I guess you could say, the most notable of which being Extended. Why did those fail, and what was it that led the search for something else to replace them?
I want to go back even further before all these things were something. Standard is kind of the genesis to all of this. For a card game to be healthy, a rotating format gives you a place where there's always a reason for players to buy new cards. And because cards are leaving when cards come in, you can choose a general power level that you think is the most fun for your game. So having a standard format means it's accessible to everybody. You get to keep the power level at a fun spot. The problem with this is that when cards rotate out, what do you do with them? you don't want players to feel like you're just throwing their investment in the trash. So this is where things like Vintage or Legacy, back in the day, it was like, oh, we need Type 2, which was standard. So then there was like Type 1.5 and Type 1, which were the original very poorly named versions of these things. But the product design point of view here is like, we need to give players something to do with cards that have rotated out of the rotating format, which is theoretically the reason why people are excited about your mainline booster set releases. A long time ago, there was Extended, which is what I think you were pointing me at here.
Yes, I don't feel pointed in any particular direction, but that seemed like an obvious place to start.
Yeah, so Extended was a funny thing. This was their first shot that I think had a good name and branding as a place where you could play your old standard cards. So when I was playing from 2005 to 2008, what was the start of it? It was Invasion was the first set, and Ravnica City of Guilds, the original Ravnica, was the most recent set at that point. So Extended was maybe 4 or 5, it was 4 years of sets, and then it would grow up to being 7 years of sets. And the thing that people forgot about for basically 3 years while Extended existed was the fact that every 3 years, Extended would throw out the previous 3 years of cards. So in the summer of 2008, when Shards of Alara releases, all of a sudden Invasion, Odyssey, and Onslaught blocks get thrown out of Extended. And a lot of people had no idea that this was coming. It's written in the tournament rules, but for 3 years there had been no rotation. And this made many people unhappy because they didn't realize that Extended was going to be a thing that would rotate on them. We messed around with Extended where we made it 7 years of cards and it rotated every 1 year for a while. And then that was confusing because people were like, wait, I don't want my side dish format to rotate. And then we made it be only 4 years and it rotated every 1 year. We tried a bunch of things. And there was a point where Aaron came to me and said, it is clear that we need a non-rotating format to be a side dish. At this point, like the phrase side dish, I think, was Aaron's way of saying, we know standard isn't going to be for everybody all the time. Sometimes standard's just not going to be great because standard sometimes isn't great. Sometimes you are going to be tired of playing standard, so we need to give you something else to do. So we need a side dish. And he came to the conclusion that that side dish needed to not be a rotating format. So we were going to have to invent a brand new tournament format out of nothing, get players to accept that it was a valid thing, which is not something we had done before at the time. And he asked me to poke around and figure out what this would be. So one of the big questions was, what is the cutoff here? And I eventually landed on 8th edition and Mirrodin as the beginning of that format because of all the arbitrary things, that was where the card frame changed. And it felt like, oh, like the new card frame, you know, when like the modern card frame happened, the word modern, great. And people started saying things like, okay, but like the Garrick versus Liliana dual decks has Wild Mongrel printed in the new card frame. What are you going to do about that? And at first some people were like, well, then that makes it be in modern. And then we all decided that playtesting every card you'd want to put into a dual deck sounded miserable. So the answer to that objection was just please stop talking about this. And it's cards originally printed in a modern booster release and just stop thinking about this. It's fine. That was kind of the beginning of modern. When we announced it, there was about to be an extended Pro Tour. There was Pro Tour Philadelphia that if we didn't ban something, it was just going to be like Cobblade all over again in a 4-year extended format. So with like 3 weeks to go, we just threw caution to the wind, told everyone that the format was going to be modern, and then Pro Tour Philadelphia happened. And That was the beginning of Modern.
Over the years, as the number of supplementary products ballooned and you had all of these cards appearing in the Modern card frame for the first time, were you getting feedback that this was counterintuitive to some players, or did that somewhat arbitrary cutoff prove to be easy enough to understand for the majority there?
It was good enough. I think the majority of Magic players don't actually know, like, year by year what the release schedule was and where a thing was printed. So, I've had the complaint before about Historic, for example, that it's like, look, the only way to know what's in Historic is to, like, do a search on Gatherer or Scryfall or whatever, to which most people reasonably have told me, like, how do you think people know what's in Modern? Like, no one knows what set Flamekin Harbinger was printed in. You're a freak, which is, like, fair, because I do know what every card was printed in, and it's fair to call me a freak in that way. So, yeah, it was like people just look it up, and it's fine. And also, I still think it was by far correct to not have to worry about, like, what card you were putting in a random duel deck later on.
If you had more freedom of choice over where that initial cutoff was, do you think it would have been wiser to place it somewhere different?
The highest priority at the time was getting players to believe that this thing was legitimate at all. And the card frame, when I just tested spots, like cutoffs combined with reasoning, I think the best pure game design decision would have been 9th edition and Ravnica, because that's kind of when we actually got good at making standard formats. And Brian Schneider really figured out how to do things well, and then he handed things off to Eric, and like that's just where the better designed cards are. And that explanation kind of got people to just tilt their heads and roll their eyes at me, where, the card frame was like, oh yeah, cool.
When you're deciding on where that cutoff is and what this format's going to look like, you don't have the time or the manpower, I'm guessing, to go through and actually stress test each of these different possible, instantiations of Modern. So you're having to theorycraft all of this, essentially. What do you do to nail down, after that cutoff is decided, but then also what the initial ban list is going to be and what the rough mission statement, if you like, for this format should be?
I would say that the most important thing was getting the marketing message right. And then past that, all we wanted was for Modern to not be broken in the same way that past formats people didn't like were broken. So Fairies was all over standard for a while. Fairies was kind of nutty and 4-year extended for a while also. And we were just like, okay, like, I don't think Bitter Blossom's going to be a problem if you're allowed to play all the things you're allowed to play in Modern, but like, better safe than sorry, we're just banning Bitter Blossom, because screw it. We can't have those go wrong in the same way. So we banned the obviously screwed up things, and then we also banned the things that, like, if it went screwed up in that particular way, the appearance would be very bad. And so those were the two categories of things we banned. And I think later on, we eventually started unbanning the things in the second category, but it was more important that the launch go well. So we banned, quote unquote, too many things in order to be safe.
I know that first Pro Tour resulted in a lot of additional bans, but at least looking back on it, it looks like it was a lot of stuff that was exciting for people to watch, and that feels like something that led to having people believe up front that the format was legitimate, because they hadn't seen these things before, and they wanted to get in on the ground floor with them.
Yeah, that sounds right. I also think that there's just a lot of excitement around the idea of, like, this format doesn't rotate. That the message, like, the user story there is like, as a player, I want my dead standard cards to always be playable in this format. And when we say it won't rotate, the subconscious way that the player takes it at that point is, my cards will always be good, because certain things that will show up later in the history of Magic had not started happening yet.
So that initial latch on that was successful, and people did buy into the format as legitimate. You said that it's just the non-rotating thing was a huge part about it.
Yeah.
Do you think there's anything else inherent to Modern that made it that way, or do you think that any format that was declared as like non-rotating and there's going to be a Pro Tour would have had a similar kind of catch?
I suspect that any non-rotating format that had a Pro Tour and an organized play push would have had a similar effect. I think that that's fundamentally just what everybody wanted at that point. And, you know, if I had been more of a reptilian min-maxer of value of the thing, I probably would have gone to 9th edition and Ravnica, just because the bigger the format is, the less effective it is as a way to go play your new dead standard cards.
Yeah, it seemed like, or maybe did it seem inevitable to you at the time that eventually, given Modern's position as a non-rotating format, and given that eventually it was going to mushroom from, 7 years of sets at its inception to going on 20 years worth of sets now, that eventually there would need to be something new filling that same role. And that became Pioneer, and I guess the constraints of Arena forced Historic to, come into existence.
Yeah.
It seemed like, that was only a matter of time, and then who knows, in 5 years, there may need to be some proto-Pioneer wedge in between the two of those.
One thing that was definitely driving Modern was also that we wanted to create some value for older cards, because it was really important to Aaron that we be able to make some money off of whatever this older format was. So in the short term, it's like, we make Modern, some of your dead standard cards will be playable in this, it'll be great. At some point, Modern gets big enough that you're like, okay, so if I want to make money off of Modern, the way that I do that now is I do some reprint sets. So you make the Modern Masters things. And, that's great. But then at some point, that's the only way you have to make money off of people wanting to play Modern. And because the standard sets don't realistically contribute anymore, one way that you can get around that is you can make Throne of Eldraine and just push your power level to be absolutely bonkers, because it's like, okay, what if standard actually just did contribute to Modern consistently? Turns out the answer is you break the hell out of standard and you make it so that a lot of future cards don't get to do anything, and you ban 1,000 things in standard, and that's maybe not great. So I think they reasonably decided that it was not a good idea to use just push the power level of standard to accomplish the job. But then if you're like, okay, I want to make new cards because that makes us the most money, and I want them to be in Modern because Modern is a thing that we've created that players want to play and we should be monetizing because we're a business and we're product managers who also like money and having our business be alive. You go and you make Modern Horizons 1 and 2. And the problem with this is that you have well and truly given up on the promise of Modern being a place for dead standard cards when you go and print Ragavan and Urza Saga. Like, what you're basically saying at this point is that we are now a very slowly rotating format that has extra expensive booster packs that releases a set once a year. And, maybe it's Modern Horizons 1, maybe it's Modern Horizons 2. Sometimes it's Lord of the Rings Modern set for some reason, because you'd rather do that than Modern Horizons 3. But that is now what Modern is. From a player experience point of view and from a business point of view, you've just made the higher power level non-rotating format that you get to make $90 Ragavans once a year in. I mean, it's funny. I've worked on card games that are not Magic, and every time I have pointed to Magic Standard as this is the way to go, executives at other game companies basically say, no human would ever agree to these terms. This is extortionary. You cannot do the rotating thing. It is an aberration that that standard in Magic has gone so well as it has for so long. This is unsustainable. And for a while, I was like, no, this is just how it is. But as you're pointing out, more and more people do seem to be falling off of the standard train. And I think that one reason that that's true is that modern, there's something nice about it not rotating. I think a lot of people end up just playing Commander because they're actually much less serious of tournament players than anyone expected, and that's driving a lot of Magic revenue more than people thought. But I do think another piece is that you were talking about, okay, so I guess you have to make Pioneer to be the place where you play dead standard cards. They did, and I think it was starting to work out, and then there was a global pandemic, and then Arena is very hungry for more revenue, so they skipped Pioneer and went all the way to Historic. So they immediately have Modern, and they don't have anything like Pioneer. There's like a broken link in this chain where your business really wants the mainline standard booster sets to be a thing that's appealing to people, and they really want people to be playing standard. But the link where my dead standard cards still have value to me somewhere in a format that has serious OP support is just not there. Like, I think if I were running Arena live ops, I would want as quickly as possible to get Pioneer to be a real thing on the platform. I would want the Arena opens that have cash prizes to be like, right when a set comes out, it's standard so that you drive card purchases right away. The next one is draft, or sealed deck or draft, so that you extend the lifetime of people being excited about the limited format. And then the third one is Pioneer, because you've had time to get all the cards. I want to remind you that, like, when these standard cards die, there will still be a place for you to go. And like, Historic would not be a thing I would be maybe pushing in the same way. Like, maybe half of the third ones are Historic and half of them are Pioneer, but like, I really think without something like Pioneer or Extended, you will get people who are not willing to follow you on the standard train, because when things fall off of standard, it's too painful to just have them do nothing.
I know it's kind of like that release schedule is kind of weird in terms of like if you're printing directly into Modern, like how often would you be doing that? But I guess the question I have, because we mentioned the Lord of the Rings set, which as the day we're recording this just came out, I'm kind of interested, if Modern's role has changed from being, letting people play their standard cards, what is the role that it's playing now, and is absorbing alternate releases part of that, kind of the way that, Legacy or whatever absorbed alternate releases for, a decade before Modern got one?
Yeah, well, I think there was a sense for a while inside Wizards, and this is slightly cynical, but I also get where it's coming from, where someone would say like, oh, well, like, you're going to release this set and it's going to do a bunch of weird things to like Modern and Vintage and Legacy, and like, why you're like messing up what people like about this thing. And the response to that is like, well, I would care about that if they bought our cards ever still. And while on one hand it sounds really bitter and angry, like, Magic is a thing that has to pay for itself. And I think it's reasonable for someone to say, like, look, if you want Modern to be a thing that we support over time, it has to be a thing that also it makes money for the business. And if it's the big format and you can cash in kind of the big format powerful cards by making one set a year that's a premium product, I don't begrudge them that. Like, I think that doing the game design work for that is really hard, and Ragavan in particular is a design that rankles me to no end. But when I look at the actual impact that Modern Horizons 2 has had, like, Ragavan is the only card that really deeply offends me in a visceral way, and even then it's like turning out fine, I guess. So like, maybe they're doing it right. If Modern players are happy to spend $500 a year to stay up with what's going on in these supplemental products, then like, maybe, and they're happy with that rate of change, maybe this is good for everybody.
I guess we've talked a lot about, standard and how that fits in. I think that the other thing that has kind of changed is the rise of Commander, which I think was kind of taking off about the same time as Modern was. And I guess it's probably worth talking about, if we're diving into this topic of formats and the relations. Was there talk about Commander as a viable thing as like that non-rotating format? And like, how do you think that, as Modern sort of evolved and took off, how did those two coexist? Like, what role do they play for each other?
Well, I think Commander is in a very similar place to Modern in that for a while we weren't really sure how to make cards that would be great in Commander, and then we figured it out, and now we are making Commander. I keep saying we like I'm still there. You never really leave. That's one lesson of this. But now, quote unquote, we are making Commander decks with brand new cards. There's Commander draftable sets. We know what kind of cards at this point Commander players are looking to buy, and we've solved the problem of like them being able to not engage with the new content by figuring out how to make the right new content. So like and I think there are people who would complain that like by making Commander specific cards, we have pushed out or rotated out a bunch of older cards that felt more like they came into Commander organically instead of being like, here is the best Bant Blink Commander now. Could buy other cards, but we are doing that, and that's kind of the price of being a format that drives Magic play, is it needs to become a format that drives Magic sales. So I kind of see what's happening to Commander as being very, very similar to what's happening to Modern, in that we are now printing cards directly into it. And that means that it gets to support the business a lot better.
Let's circle back to Modern's debut on the big stage then with Pro Tour Philadelphia, where with 3 weeks to go, this bombshell drops. Players now are preparing for this brand new format. What were your, hopes and expectations for that event, and how did that differ from the kind of, the company line that you had to give voice to at the time, in terms of like, were you secretly thinking, oh God, this is going to be like the Wild West, this is going to be hopelessly broken? Was part of you hoping for that or fearing that? Like, what was the internal monologue at that time?
I was really hoping that it was going to be exactly the thing everybody wanted, and it would feel stable and everything would be fine. Definitely the outcome of that tournament was, holy crap, we're going to have to ban a bunch of stuff. But I think that it did the right work because people were excited about it. And we came out and said, like, hey, this is going to be a little bananas for a while, but we're excited and you seem excited and let's all be excited together. And I feel like I wouldn't go back and change anything. Like, I mean, look at how well it worked and for how long. As a player, I had a lot of fun playing Modern and preparing for Modern tournaments. I played 2 like Grand Prix and PPTQ seasons that were Modern. Enjoyed it a lot. Have no complaints about what I went through there. Like, would I do what I did knowing that I was creating like 7 years of great Modern gameplay that happened? Yeah, absolutely. And is it right for the business that we made this thing that you could print Modern Horizons into? Yeah, it's absolutely right. Like, I think no wrong game design decisions were made. I think no wrong product decisions were made. And I think like from me putting entertainment out into the world that I'm proud of point of view, like, yeah, I would go back and change absolutely nothing.
From that specific event, are there any memories or anything like that still stick with you after close to a decade?
Yeah, I think the Storm decks scared me a lot personally. I think it was kind of good that like John Finkel only made top 16 and not top 8. I was really happy that there was a somewhat fair creature deck in the finals. I think that the match between Josh Utter-Layton and Sam Black in the semifinals is like one of the most incredible matches of Magic I've seen in my entire life. There was a lot of really neat stuff in that event. Like, 2 affinity decks in the top 8 was pretty good, I think, for saying like, look, old decks you remember, hooray. and the fact that Disciple of the Vault was not in that affinity deck was also like a surprise to me at the time. In hindsight, sure, but like, you know, it wasn't exactly the same affinity deck as before. It was a little different kind, and that was also pretty cool. So yeah, the top 8 was great. It was great. Everybody wanted to buy new cards to build their decks, and it felt like you got a new, fresh chance to look at history. I don't know. It was really good.
Yeah, so that was the first Modern Pro Tour, and it ends up being the first of many, or at least a few. But there was a time where Modern's place as a fixture of Pro Tour level play was kind of up in the air, and you had a lot of the fans clamoring for a Modern Pro Tour every year, and it seemed like the reception within the pro community was a lot more mixed. So what did you make of that differing reaction? And from your vantage point on the inside, what was the role of the Modern PT specifically within that ecosystem?
Yeah, the Modern Pro Tour was, let's see, people don't like having cards banned in Modern. That was one thing that we discovered when we would ban like Birthing Pod or Mox Opal. A lot of people would be real mad. And from my perspective, a lot of the reason why we had to ban so many cards in Modern was that we were running a Modern Pro Tour every year. Things don't change very often. Pros are very good at figuring out what the best decks are when things don't change very often. So people want to watch Modern, but also they don't want to have their things banned. But the more you give them Modern to play at the Pro Tour, the quicker we move toward things being banned, because the pros will solve the problem. The pros also find it boring to play Modern that doesn't change all that much, but like, I don't really care what they think so much. The question is like, how does it affect players at your local game store? So the answer of like the thing where it gets solved and then you have to ban cards, like that sucks. But I think I was kind of too afraid of it being solved and boring over time. And I was like trying to prolong the life of Modern as being like an unsolved thing for people to play at local game stores, where I think that was just probably the wrong perspective. I think Modern was doing the job it was supposed to do. And the right product move there is to like, let the pros solve it, I guess ban cards sometimes, but like, I think it would have been better to make Pioneer faster and start the Modern Horizons cycle of things going faster, because a really good way to inject life into having a Modern Pro Tour is like make a bunch of new content for people to try to digest and figure out. Like imagine there was a Modern Pro Tour like a month and a half after Modern Horizons 2 came out. Like that would be a hell of a spectacle to watch. The pros wouldn't complain. It would sell a bunch of booster packs. Everybody's happy to the degree that people are happy buying new cards for Modern, and then just run like Pioneer once a year, run Modern after the Modern Horizons set once a year, run Standard every 6 months, and you have a really healthy Pro Tour cycle. Mm-hmm. So I think I was short-sighted in that, like, I shouldn't have been trying to protect Modern from anyone. People want to see it on the big stage. They want to feel like it's a valid path to being at the top of Magic, and like, just accept what it needs to be in terms of like, it's not like there should be a non-rotating format, but Modern's not it. Modern is where you drop Ragavan and Urza Saga in once a year and let people figure it out.
So that was Tom LaPille, and now our final guest for this project, and I can't believe I'm saying that, and I'm not sure it's actually true, and if I'm forgetting someone, I'm really sorry, but I think our final guest is going to be Zac Hill, who is a great person to end all of this with, and we will hear from him after a short message.
If you are looking to sell your Magic the Gathering cards, it's never been easier than heading over to starcitygames.com/sell. With a 30% store credit bonus and a fast turnaround time, there's no reason to sell to anyone else. Enjoy 4 convenient ways to sell your cards. Check out our buy list for specific cards, ship your cards on over with the ship and sell program. You can come on into the Star City Games Comics and Game Store in Roanoke, Virginia, and if you have over 500,000 cards or own a store and want to move some of your bulk out, we can come to you. Go to starcitygames.com/sell, that's SELL, to get the details on the best way to sell your Magic the Gathering cards.
So we're joined for this segment now by Zac Hill, who has worn many hats throughout his time in Magic. Pro Tour mainstay for a while, fellow columnist over at Star City Games, commentator, game designer, and many more. But let's set the scene here. Let's go back to mid-2011. What was going on in your Magic career at that time?
So I was in-house at Wizards of the Coast. I was working as one of the lead game designers on the Magic development team. And one of the questions that we were thinking about at that point in time was basically how to create formats or other ways of playing Magic over and above standard and booster draft that could enhance the life cycle of Magic cards and create opportunities for folks to play that offer different play patterns from what standard and the most prominent other formats were offering. At the time, there was a giant gap between the major supported formats, which were Legacy on the one hand, which was everything that had ever existed, and Standard, which was only the most recent 2 years of expansions. There was a big gap in the middle for something that was accessible to folks that wanted to be able to play more of their cards, and no one really knew what that was. The contemporary offering was a format called Extended that I can't even explain to you now because it didn't mean anything. It was basically defined as the cards that were legal and extended. And so there was never very much any uptake beyond when we forced people to play the format, because it wasn't even coherent what it was. We thought we could do better. We knew we could do better, and we were trying to brainstorm something up.
Yeah, it struck me at the time that Extended it served a certain niche in the competitive landscape, and if you were on the PTQ grind, then you would play Extended for the season because that's what the format was. But no one was going into their LGS and looking for a pickup game of Extended. That just wasn't a thing that anyone ever did.
That's exactly right. It sort of had all of the problems of other rotating formats without any of the upsides. So like Standard, it rotated. So it's not like you could keep an extended deck together that you could play with slight modifications for years and years and years. And yet it only extended so far back. So it wasn't like, oh, you had some cards that you remember from back when you used to play or your favorite time in Magic. You're going to come and see which of those you could play and maybe create a new shelf for it. You couldn't do that either. So unless you were, like you said, a PTQ regular or a PTQ mainstay, there wasn't really a lot the format could offer for you. Now, I feel bad saying that because it's my historic all-time favorite format, but I was in a very small minority of people in that regard.
Oh, I'm with you there for sure, but good to be honest about, how much of a minority we were there. But was that one of the priorities then in-house at the time of when you're brainstorming alternatives, having something that was more durable and something that, people could invest in and not just, pick up when they had to? Was that one of the explicit goals there?
That's exactly right. We wanted to be able to create a non-rotating format that if you sort of bought into, you'd be able to play and sustain for quite a while. It needed to seem kind of like a good investment that would be a payoff in your long-term ability to play Magic. We had a few goals. The first is, we didn't want it to contain cards on the reserve list. One of the biggest obstacles to Legacy was just card availability. When we tried to have Legacy in the World Championships, to some degree it was awesome. And I remember playing in that World Championships. There was always an asterisk next to it because, for a lot of players in a lot of parts in the world, it just wasn't possible to pick up a set of dual lands, right? So you had people playing at the highest level of competition that were having to play, Ravnica duels instead of regular duels due to just card availability. So we knew we didn't want to have that issue. But over and above that, there were a ton of options in terms of where to start, potentially where to end. We talked about keeping standard legal cards out of Modern or whatever this format would be in the first place so that there wasn't overlap between that and Standard, and so that cards could kind of take on a new life. People would say things like card X, Y, or Z may have never hit in Standard. Will there be an opportunity for it to hit in this other format? We talked about stuff like that. But in general, the goal was to create a non-rotating format that folks could buy into that was competitive at the highest level or capable of being showcased at the highest level, but didn't offer as prohibitive of a level to entry as the currently available Eternal options.
And so this early prototype of Modern got its debut, I guess you would say, at the Magic Online Community Cup, which is a thing of the past at this point. But at the time, this was this fun, regular occurrence where, community figures, Magic Online prolific players would come together for this to battle against the Wizards of the Coast team there. And so you look at the roster there now, you have the voice of the Pro Tour now, Marshall Sutcliffe, before he was ever in the booth, a much younger Luis Scott Vargas, and so on. You were on the team there, and so your first impression of Modern was really the first impression that anyone got to have. So how did the format look to you at that very early stage?
That's right. So one of the things we were trying to do with the Community Cup was to actually give an opportunity to break some of the parameters of Modern so that we could go ahead and ban anything egregious before it kind of got out in the wild. One of our goals for the format, and one of the reasons we chose the Modern timeline, was that we thought it might be a way of showcasing a lot of old Standard decks that people had bought into for Standard. They had a lot of the cards in their collection. They had fond memories of those cards, but then the cards rotate out of Standard and never really became vintage or legacy staples. So on the one hand, we wanted to showcase decks that fit that category. On the other hand, what we didn't want to have happen was for all the old demons that had terrorized Standard formats to become just the boogeyman of this new format and have to deal with all the same unfun play patterns that we dealt with before. So the questions that we were asking at the very beginning are like, is Fairies just going to come in and dominate everything again? Are we going to have, ridiculous 5-color mana bases there where you can kind of cast everything and archetypes don't stratify? So in the Community Cup, we wanted to kind of allow for a bit of a ridiculous free-for-all so that we could see what the most egregious strategies that came to life were and get out ahead of them before we debuted the format on a major competitive stage.
As a quick tangent there, it seems like that idea of wanting Standard cards to age gracefully and have some continued relevance, that has been a goal of various formats that have popped up over time. So Modern in those initial stages, Historic, which as the alternative offering initially on Arena was marketed as, once your cards rotate out of Standard, this is where they go. And now it's mutated into God knows what. And even Pioneer, when that came into being, right, where in late 2019, the age range encompassed by that format was about the same as Modern back in 2011, right? It's 7 or 8 years of sets. And now Modern is going on 18 to 20 years of sets. And so that step in between seemed like a necessary requirement to get those Standard cards to remain useful still, but that hasn't really been the case in Pioneer so much. So why do you think that goal has never really been realized by any of these new offerings?
I think the reasons are different from each of the distinctive formats. So in early Modern, I think you actually did see a fair amount of that. I mean, you remember the World Magic Cup tournament, I believe it was, or it may have been the World Championships, where basically every deck that showed up was like a wild Nakatl mid-range zoo deck, featuring a lot of the cards that had been powerhouses in Standard, but weren't really able to shine independent of that context because you needed, the Ravnica duels to pair with your Nakatls or whatever. So I think in some respects, it's been able to showcase some aspects of that. There's been kind of morphs or transmogrifications of the Valakut decks and things like that. But the reality is that goal is a little bit more challenging to develop for, because any one piece of the puzzle affects the texture of everything else. And that doesn't just mean a powerful card that goes into the deck. It also means the existence of a card that can invalidate entire strategies, right? So if you have Rest in Peace in a format where in Standard it was never legal, you might find a lot more viable graveyard-based decks for the entirety of that Standard format that are obsoleted by the existence of a single card, right? And the converse is true too. There may be one sort of strategy where the best way to recur an effect, for example, is something like, Dreadhorde Arcanist, and you're never going to use the second best version of the effect, even though that was the best version of the effect for the entirety of the life of the standard format, right? So there's all these different variables that I think are mostly just related to emergent complexity that make it very, very difficult to kind of allow a format as it once was to recur in a new context, because there's just too many different factors that play into the texture of that format.
And so against this backdrop, you have Pro Tour Philadelphia on the docket for in a few months' time. And this was scheduled to be extended, which at this point would have just rotated. So it's a fresh format. So maybe that's an interesting new puzzle to sink your teeth into if you're playing in the tournament. But it also means that people watching from the outside don't really have any prior investment in it or any reason to get excited. And then with just 3 weeks to go, the announcement drops this bombshell that actually the format for this event is going to be Modern. This is going to be Modern's debut on the big stage. So take us through whatever you're happy to share about the internal process that led up to that, and then what you made of the public reaction to that at the time.
Definitely. So, it was obviously very, very controversial to shift the format of the Pro Tour at the time we did. We knew it would be difficult on the players. We knew it would be, a confounding of expectations on the viewership side. I think what went into that were a number of things. The first is that Pro Tours need to serve a strategic objective. One of the main versions of that objective is selling Magic cards. And you're not going to sell a lot of Magic cards if you're promoting a format that isn't going to exist after the tournament happens, right? And it's actively not, I don't just mean from kind of a cynical corporate perspective. It's not cool to do something really awesome and exciting, get people excited about how awesome that is, at least the folks that are watching the broadcast, and then basically say, actually, you can never do that, right? I think that's a very bad and borderline manipulative experience, right? So I think that's one dimension of it. The second dimension of it is, of course, Pro Tours are not cheap to produce, right? So you need to justify why you're doing that, and hosting something of a format that would be characterized as it was happening as a dead format is just not going to generate, engagement or excitement that is the reason that you're hosting the tournament to begin with. I think from a competitor's perspective, I was definitely kind of a voice of, I'd been playing on the Pro Tour very regularly until comparatively recently from there. And it's definitely, a bummer that from both a card acquisition perspective and from a testing perspective, you've sunk effort into the event that you're not going to get back. But I think there were some countervailing forces to that. The first is not that many teams do that much testing that far in advance of the event. When you look at it as a function of the total volume of people that are playing in the tournament, some of the more resource testing teams get to start earlier and get to practice earlier, but the vast majority of folks in the tournament are not rigorously and reliably testing, more than X weeks out of the event. I mean, even many of us that were on quote unquote super teams, we wish we were that organized. So that was one dimension in favor of it not being as big of a deal to execute along the timeline that we did. The other is that just in general, a lot of the time newer formats give edge to folks that are better at deck building, folks that come up with innovative, creative ideas. And a lot of the time, the folks that are best at playing a game of Magic, in terms of the cards that exist on the battlefield in your hand, are not always the same folks that design, new creative and innovative decks. And so we thought that might actually, to some degree, level the playing field a little bit. That's not 100% of an accurate statement, because obviously your well-resourced testing teams can often come up with the best decks. But the point is, it's an orthogonal skill set that is good to reward and makes for good viewing, because people like to see, new crazy decks they haven't seen before, not the same old decks they've been used to seeing, week in, week out, year in, year out for a really long time, especially in the context of some of these newer formats. So I think on balance, the incentives made sense to go with the new format. We knew it would be controversial. We knew there'd be backlash. Obviously, Magic players are known for making themselves heard when they're not happy. And Magic players are also known for not being happy. So we knew there would be some noise. But on balance, I think that was what went into the decision. And looking back on it, I think I'm glad it's the decision that we made.
Nowadays, in the recent tournament calendar, many of the Mythic Championship style events, or however they're branded, they come a few weeks after the release of a new set. And this is in an information era where the moment that someone comes up with an idea, it's plastered all over Twitter and Twitch, and everyone knows about it. And before you get to the tournament itself, thousands upon thousands of games of that format have been played. And however true this is or isn't, it feels like the parameters of that format are mostly known by that point. Right. And this is the exact opposite of that, as far from that as you can possibly get, where you've had this initial testing process of the Community Cup and then the first round of changes to the ban list after that. But this is as close to the Wild West, Unchained, do whatever you want that we've seen in what I guess you would call modern Magic. Was there some concern that without that safety valve in place, that this tournament would be overrun by some horrendously broken combo deck, or one team would really solve the equation and it would seem like this new format's debut was just going to be a disaster?
Oh, it very much. I mean, not only were we worried about that, we were close to 100% sure that most of the best decks would be really ridiculous. The thesis was very much like presence most of the ban-worthy cards so that we can initiate an onslaught of bans fairly early on, so as to not have to kind of continuously be banning reams of cards in the format for years and years and years and years and years. So we figured it would kind of be ridiculous at the beginning of it, and we wanted to some degree lean into that, to basically say, like, this format is crazy. You know, we don't know what's going to happen. We're really excited to see what players come up with. We really want to shake it up. And, you know, we figured it would be easiest to start to issue slates of bans earlier and more comprehensively than to try and kind of micromanage a process here and there for N years. I think now bans are a lot more conventional than they used to be. I think back then we were a lot more sensitive about banning cards, particularly banning cards in newer contexts. But definitely, like, we expected for some totally absurd stuff to rear its head, and to some degree for that to be some of the appeal of the event, especially because, you know, without it being played at the game store level, there wasn't that much downside to stuff that was really exciting to watch, but not really exciting to play, since we'd be able to take action before the play pattern started in earnest in the mainstream.
In a way, it must have been a relief that the eventual winner in Splinter Twin, this is what became the totemic modern deck, right? That even 5 years after its ban, people are still clamoring to come back. And, you know, you didn't get to play Ponder or Preordain in it anymore, but this is the example of a deck which survived the transition from this Wild West era to the format to something a little bit more fair, a little bit more reasonable and recognizable.
Totally. And I think it also kind of embodies the play pattern that really does characterize modern. I mean, we wanted powerful, counterintuitive combinations of things. We wanted to showcase counterintuitive interactions of cards across formats, but we didn't want the game to be ending on turn 2 or 3, and we didn't want you to have to sit there while your opponent did stuff and you were acting confused, for 20 minutes at a time until you see if they could combo you out or not. So in many ways, Splinter Twin is the ideal play pattern, and that it's able to end the game really quickly once it gets an advantage. But you can't Splinter Twin people before they get to at least attempt to do their thing. So I think that, again, like you said, while the initial version of the deck was way more consistent and way more resilient than we'd ever want it to be, I think that it's a good example of the sort of prototypical modern deck as embodies the desired experience we wanted folks to have in the format.
So one principle that for a long time always undergirded the format was maybe these cards were good in standard and they're not going to be good here, but they at least had to go through standard to make their way into modern. And that has not been the case with other formats. So Legacy, for example, some of the Commander products or other supplementary sets, those cards go into Legacy, they go into Vintage, but they don't work their way backwards. That's kind of the smallest format they get to operate in. And for Modern, that was true for the longest time. So, I think the card counterspell is a great example, right? Where you had players for a long time, especially when Control seemed to be in a bad place in the format, saying, why can't we have literal counterspell here? And the answer, not to dredge up the Cavern of Souls discourse from a decade ago, but it was very clear from the outset there that, we're not getting counterspell in Standard, and therefore we're not getting counterspell in Modern. And it wasn't until the Modern Horizons sets, first in 2019 and now just a few months ago, that really changed. Did that seem at the outset like that was a necessary safety valve or more of a shackle on the format? And have your views on that changed over time?
I think there's a few dynamics to that. I mean, I think definitely there's utility of being able to enter cards into a format that wouldn't be problematic for that format, but would be problematic for Standard. And so I think in that regard, it's good to have different kind of mechanics via which to do that. I mean, I think with Legacy and the initial Commander sets, you saw the viability of that mechanic. I think cards like Flusterstorm were clearly successes. I think the play pattern of something like True Name Nemesis is significantly worse and monoaxial, that I wouldn't really consider that as a success. But I do think that there were successful iterations of bypassing Standard to put cards in a format. So, my opinion is I think that is both a good idea in the abstract and has been done well frequently. With your counterspell example, I think the example that makes the format much more inaccessible and frankly less interesting is that, a lot of the appeal of formats like Modern and to an extent formats like Commander is that they're characterized by emergent possibility. It's the players themselves that are finding niches for cards in new and exciting contexts that weren't designed to be that way. And that also creates a certain equilibrium of how rapidly the format changes, because if the cards that are making splashes within the format tend to be only those that were targeted a little bit above the normal power level for Standard, you've got a much more coherent kind of drift of cards into the format that you can kind of expect and predict. I think when the defining cards of Modern are engineered to be the cards in the Modern Horizon sets, it certainly is great for the folks that are buying Modern Horizon sets, but I think it massively decreases the coherence of the format for the much lower invested players that have been kind of casually paying attention to it for a long time, that view it as the format where they can play basically similar decks. And to have that entire brand affinity with the format upended through format defining cards, and not just format defining cards, but cards that you can't really play the format without, like Ragavan, like Urza's Saga, like Urza, I think is a bit too much in the other direction, because you've disrupted the emergent discovery and gradual evolution that allows players to be kind of retained within that format and consider it their lane. It's sort of like a bit of a new Coke phenomenon, right? Like if Modern is Coke and people like it, there's a big difference between, every once in a while offering vanilla Coke and cherry Coke, Diet Coke and Coke Zero gradually, versus saying like, nope, this isn't the old thing that you like. It's now the new thing. Deal with it. But all of that being said, I hear the sets selling like hotcakes, and I hear that Paper Magic's more popular than ever. So it's possible that I'm being old and curmudgeonly and concerned. But speaking personally, I mean, I loved Modern. I played tons of Modern. I helped invent Modern. And I just have no idea how Modern works nowadays. So, I took my hand a little bit. But
with that curmudgeon hat on, I guess, to close this out, with a decade's worth of hindsight and perspective now, what do you make of how Modern has changed over the years? And now looking back, what do you make of those first few months of Modern that you were so heavily involved in?
So I definitely, the last Modern tournament I played in was a Star City Games event in 2019. I played Eldrazi Tron. We ended up making a deep run in the final days of day 2. And I used it as an opportunity to reflect on the format. And I guess the thing that was so wild was Legacy felt like Vintage, Modern felt like Legacy, and Standard, this was when Throne of the Eldraine Standard happened, felt like Modern, right? I think early Modern felt a lot more like Legacy. And so in some ways, it's kind of just going back to that equilibrium. And of course, the more sets you release, obviously, the more powerful things are going to be. I think the early version of Modern very much did its job. It was a very popular format. I think it made a type of Magic gameplay a lot more accessible to a lot more players. I think it re-engaged a great deal of players. I mean, even now when I play casually, and most of the time if I'm not playing Cube, I'm just kind of building decks with the cards that I have and playing games with people who play Magic. The thing people say is like, oh, we're playing Modern. Now, if you look at the decks, they're not competitive Modern decks, but it's a coherent set of parameters that folks use to kind of calibrate their play pattern. And I think that in and of itself is just like a very, very good thing to have kind of a shorthand benchmark. But that said, I do think that I'm happy with the initial version of Modern at what it did. I'm happy basically with the legacy of Modern as it's gone. I'm happy with the idea that you can print stuff directly into Modern and use it as a way for folks to experience Magic who aren't necessarily interested in keeping up with the constant rotation of having to keep track of Standard all of the time. But I think that there is a risk of over proliferating formats and over engineering formats that are designed to be the, I guess, repository of a long arc of Magic's history by kind of dropping a single grenade in them and prohibiting them from fulfilling that role as kind of a gradual current of Magic's history as it evolves. I think a good heuristic for how to evaluate whether Modern's healthy or not is for a long time the conceit in Extended was, the conceit in Standard was, if it's 5 mana, it needs to end the game. And I think the consensus with Modern, at least the last time I played, is that if it was like 4 mana, it definitely needs to end the game. I think that we can consider the format to be basically healthy if you can play 4 mana cards that very significantly warp the game, but it's not just a absurd idea to cast a 4 mana spell. And I think Modern is probably unhealthy if the vast majority of powerful things you can do are 1 mana and 2 mana, and your 3 mana cards effectively end the game. So I think I would kind of bear that mark in mind. And I think that if you look at Modern decks that are popular right now and compare them to that heuristic, I think you'd get an impression of what my opinion of the state of the format is.
And with that, our Pro Tour Philadelphia 10-year anniversary episode finally comes to a close. It's a celebration of Modern, and it's a celebration of Magic and the community at its best that it has fostered around it. It has been an absolute treat and privilege working on this, producing this, compiling this, and if any of you out there enjoy listening to this half as much as I've enjoyed creating it with Ari and with so many other talented people, then that will be a real victory for all of us. So thank you for listening. Thank you to all of our guests for giving their memories and insight and experience here. We will be back next week with our regular programming. But until then, thank you once again and take care.